Welcome to TECM 5195. We're continuing in on our editing for style section of the course, and specifically we'll talk about editing for passive and active voice. As I've been trying to do, I'm trying to contextualize teaching editing passive and active voice to teaching it in your own classrooms of technical communication. So three things that I'll point out, and then I'll also sort of pepper in some other strategies as we go through editing these editing for passive and active voice. But three things that I want to point out. One, you can use humorous examples, and I think this is probably universal for teaching any kind of writing, but I like to use humorous examples for teaching passive and active. So one example that I typically use is, if someone clogged the toilet, would you want to call that person out or not? Right? And so if you did, you might use active voice, John clogged the toilet, versus passive, the toilet was clogged. Right? So the two have very different outcomes depending on whether or not you choose passive or active as you're writing it. So you can use some humorous examples that help students remember the difference more easily. Secondly, we can use passive and active to teach ideas and concepts of audience, context, and purpose. Because really the main idea of passive and active voice are, it's two ways to construct particular sentences, and one is not necessarily better than the other. And it's important to teach students these ideas of one is better suited for particular audiences or for particular contexts or for particular purposes. So this sort of rhetorical triangle, this idea of teaching these rhetorical principles to students as you're teaching them passive and active voice is a really good thing to do. And then thirdly, you can connect teaching passive and active voice to the larger writing process. So again, it's this idea of writing is not a prescriptive set of rules. It's not a do this and you'll have an effective piece of writing. The same is with passive and active voice. It's not a thing where there's a prescriptive set of rules that say only use active voice or only use passive voice. It's important to teach students that writing is contextually bound. And so those are three ways that you can sort of teach passive and active voice in a technical communication classroom, some strategies for that. Okay, so before we can decide between active versus passive voice, when to use one or the other, and if we're teaching technical communication, we need to actually be able to identify active versus passive voice. And so this comes from Revising Professional Writing, and I think it's a really good way to identify both active and passive voice. So when we're identifying active voice or passive voice, we're looking at sentences in two different ways or through two different lenses. So the first is through a thematic lens, where we're looking at what are the actual components of the sentence doing. And so we can look at them in three roles: agent, action, and patient. So agent is the thing that is doing the action, and the patient is the thing that is receiving the action. Okay. We can also look at sentences syntactically, where we've got subjects, which are the first noun phrase in a sentence. We've got a verb, and then we've got direct objects, whatever follows the verb phrase. And so we have active voice when the agent is in the subject position. When the agent is in the subject position. So the first thing we need to do when we're identifying voice is identify the agent and the patient. What are the agent and the patient in this sentence? And so the easiest way to do that is to just go straight to the verb and to go, okay, the verb's completed. Someone or something has to complete something. Find that. Okay, the student, that's the thing that completed the thing. And then something has to receive the action of the verb, the project. That's the patient. So when the agent is in subject position, when the agent is the first noun phrase in a sentence, you've got active voice. So in this case, the student, which is our agent, is in subject position. It's the first noun phrase. So this is an example of active voice. The opposite is true for passive voice. Whenever the patient is in the subject position, you've got passive voice, right? And so we know that our patient is the project because our verb is completed. Someone has to complete something. The project can't complete anything. So we know that the project is our patient. So the project is in subject position. We know that we have passive voice. The project was completed, and then that by phrase, we can take it or leave it. So that's why that's in parentheses. So you could say the project was completed, and then you could just put a period after it. That's called an agentless passive. There's no agent. Or we could say the project was completed by the student, in which case we've added that by phrase, which is the actual agent of our sentence. Okay, so that's identifying active and passive voice. Active is agent is in subject position. Passive voice is patient is in subject position. Other markers of passive voice. You need a verb form of to be followed by the past participle. And if you see an optional by phrase, that's also a good clue that you've got passive voice. Let's take a second and practice identifying active and passive voice. Click anywhere on the screen to launch the practice exercise. Okay, so now that we're able to identify active and passive voice, let's talk about how can we decide whether or not to use active versus passive. There's really three things I want to cover, and the first is determining the focus of the sentence. The second is using passive for generalizable actions and results. And then the third is to be consistent for cohesion. We won't really look at the third one very closely, so I'll just quickly say, if you're going to start a paragraph with active voice, you probably want to complete the paragraph with active voice, and vice versa with passive. So to determine the focus of the sentence, so a basic rule of thumb is use active voice to focus on the agent, use passive voice to focus on the patient. So thinking through, again, rhetorically and contextually, what do you want to highlight in this sentence as an editor or as a writer? So we can take a look at these two examples. The top is a passive voice sentence. Affordable tuition rates were implemented and have led to positive student satisfaction. The second is an active voice sentence. The president of the university implemented affordable tuition rates, which has led to positive student satisfaction. Okay, so neither one of these is correct, but we have to think about the context. So if the context is, the president is writing an annual report and wants to show off all of his or her accomplishments for the year, they definitely want to use active voice. We want to focus on the agent, the doer of the action. If the context is we want to write a piece of marketing material to the parents of potential students of this particular university, that context is very different. We want to focus on the patient. We want to focus on affordable tuition. So we use passive voice and we foreground the patient. Affordable tuition rates were implemented and have led to positive student satisfaction. We actually don't even mention the president at all in the passive voice version of this sentence. And so one of the things that I want to really point out is it matters what the context is. The context is very, very important in deciding between passive and active voice. Also something you can continue to teach your students. Also, you can use passive voice for generalizable actions and results. So really think about methods and results sections of an IMRAD report. If you've never heard of an IMRAD report, these are scientific reports. IMRAD stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. So basically every scientific research article is written in this genre or in this structure. So if we take a look at the first example, the active voice example, I asked participants to complete the survey. It's kind of sounds silly because no one cares about the person doing the asking, especially in a scientific research article. They care about the process. So they care about the participants. They don't care about the researcher all that much. And so a passive voice reading might be better. Participants were asked to complete the survey. A few teaching tips when you're teaching about generalizable actions and results and when you're teaching about active versus passive voice. One, you can use this as an opportunity to teach about the IMRAD report structure. right? So this thing exists. Everyone that writes science reports uses this convention. You should probably know it, right? And so to teach students about that, you can also teach students about genre conventions, right? So part of genre conventions aren't just the headings that you use or the order by which these sections of the report go in. It's also the way that you construct sentences. And then thirdly, you can use this to teach students that passive voice is not evil, right? Passive voice, oftentimes people teach prescriptively and they say never use passive voice. It takes more words, it's more ambiguous. Well, sometimes there's reasons to be ambiguous. And this is one reason, is you want to focus on the patient when you're talking about generalizable actions or results. So those are just some ways that you can bring in passive and active into your classroom. So that's passive and active voice. There'll be a short exercise for choosing between the two. Do those exercises and then we'll be through with this video.